Hello, everyone, and welcome to Healthy at Work. My name is Catherine Wilcox, a workplace health specialist with a big passion for helping people thrive at work. From the home office to the corporate office, from the assembly line to the front line, I've got you covered here for your healthiest life at work. Now, let's dive into today's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healthy at Work. I'm your host, Catherine, and this week on the show, I wanted to talk about some emerging trends in workplace health. Now, one of the main reasons why I wanted to time this episode with the onset of summer is that there are a number of industries where we experience a bit of a slowdown around this time of year. That's not the case for all industries, for sure, depending on what you do for work. But I know in often public sector, government, times where people are taking holidays, the teaching profession, when folks are away, we have a bit more space sometimes to really think about and plan our work. And so the trends I'm going to be sharing with you today are things that I think, if you're somebody that is responsible for workplace health and planning in your workplace, that absolutely you should be tracking and considering as, we do see these trends having a significant impact on our workplaces today. And if you are a worker, if you're an employee that's listening to this show as well, I invite you to reflect a bit on how each of these potential trends impacts you today, as well as, what you might need to be planning for and thinking about into the future as we think about our health and happiness at work. So, the first one I wanted to dive into is top of mind for many people these days. It's AI, artificial intelligence, which is now a coworker for many of us. Again, depending on what we do for work, we might be feeling that in some industries a bit more than others. But regardless, I think, all of our lives socially, collectively are being influenced by artificial intelligence. And we certainly see this in the workplace as well. One of the things I think workplaces need to really be tracking as it relates to the health aspects of artificial intelligence is the ways in which this technology, can be creating a lot of anxiety for workers around displacement, their job security. Also, from a health perspective, we know that artificial intelligence can be quite biased in terms of the information that's provided, and even dangerous in certain circumstances when people are seeking mental health support, for example, using artificial intelligence. Now, that's not a blanket statement. There may be some benefit, again, to technology being used to support health and mental health. But as we all know, this technology is really accelerated. And what is often lagging behind are some of those ethical considerations, right, for how it's being used and if it's helpful, hurtful, or what parameters need to be put in place so that the information being gleaned from it is actually representative and inclusive and not creating harm. So artificial intelligence, how is it impacting you? How is it impacting your workplace health? I'd love to hear in the comments section if anybody has anything they would like to share around that. So certainly something as you're, planning and, if you're using the summertime again to think about your programming related to workplace health, certainly to skill up in this area, to learn more about what's happening is a really important consideration, I think, for training plans in the workplace today. Another area I think we have to give our attention to in considering workplace health into the future is generational difference. So, we have people staying longer in the workforce than ever before. There are economic drivers of that for many people. Also, just the increase in lifespan and longevity may mean people may actually voluntarily choose, to want to extend their careers and work a bit longer. Regardless of the reason for that, what we see is greater generational diversity in the workplace today. And, this can be a source of great strength to workplaces. It certainly lends itself to, having a diversity of different social perspectives, skills, even. In the workplace. However, it can also be a driver of conflict, right? If there are, different values that social generations are bringing that aren't acknowledged, for example, or considered for in the way that we map out our workplace health programming. So, what are some examples of this? If you think about your employee benefit program, for example, just looking at what types of benefit offerings are provided and whether they might advantage or disadvantage people depending on their age, right? And their age span. One example of things to kind of think about as we acknowledge, we do have different generations in the workplace today. And, how can we, learn from one another? How can we really leverage one another's experience and strengths and what we're bringing in? That's something that workplaces are going to have to figure out. So just thinking about for yourself, right? There can be some good reflection there for individual workers too. Where do you find yourself in terms of, your generation and, is this a source of strength or is it a source of challenge in your workplace? Something else that's top of mind, and I'm located in British Columbia, Canada, and every June, this time of year in particular, there can be a lot of anxiety. Many of us feel around wildfire and climate emergencies, and regardless of where you live or where you're geographically located and listening from or watching from today, certainly climate and climate emergencies are something that every workplace needs to be tracking and considering in terms of the impacts to the workplace, business continuity, but also individual health and employees. So, what is your crisis management response, program? How will you support workers that are impacted by climate emergencies? How are you supporting workers who are experiencing climate anxiety as well? We see a lot of rapid change in our environment. There can be a lot of loss and grief that can come alongside that. So increasingly, I think workplaces will need to be considering how we accommodate for not only emergent, situations that we'll need to adapt to. So, fires, floods, hurricanes, but also, and heat. That's another one that we often think about in the summer as well. But, also how we will support people as we move through this period of, grief, of loss, of concern, of anxiety that many people are experiencing. Social isolation and loneliness. This is so, so big. And so pervasive, looking across the globe, the World Health Organization, for example, has some great information, has done some great analysis around this and the impacts globally to people around social isolation, loneliness. Also, polarization can be a part of this too. So how are we ensuring there is sufficient human connection in the places that we work? Now, there's many different ways of doing that. What I see is a lot of workplaces returning people to the office as a way of trying to bolster human connection. And people have different takes on this, right? In terms of in-person time, remote, hybrid workplaces. My personal perspective is that simply returning people to the office doesn't necessarily bolster human connection. It means that people are in the same physical space, but they might not actually be connecting. They might be in their work area with their noise canceling headphones on and not actually connecting to anyone very much at all. So it's more about quality, I would say here, my perspective again, than quantity or physicality. How are we supporting workplaces to be places where people can be seen and heard and understood and known and experience a sense of belonging. So really turning our mind to that. Again, many workplaces in early 2026 went through some of these changes, right? With people kind of coming back to a physical office. So it's a good time to evaluate, has that had the cultural impact that was intended? Is there something else that needs to be accommodated for or designed into the way that you work to be able to support and bolster and nourish human connection? The other thing I wanted to acknowledge was precariousness. And this is something, that relates to not only economic precariousness, so, financial, stability in the world that we're navigating, also job security. Many people are really, in this time of fiscal constraint across many industries, feeling anxiety around the security of their own jobs, their careers, also just the precariousness of our global situation. We have a lot of geopolitical tension, war, um, instability, happening in our markets, in our world, a lot of human impact. So it can be a really hard time to be alive as a human in 2026. And things can feel incredibly overwhelming and fragile, for many people. So again, how do we provide a sense of stability, and connection in our workplaces to really accommodate for a time where, there is a lot of volatility? What are people leaning into? What can people trust? Which, brings me to the last point I wanted to make today around the erosion of trust in the world today. And that could be trust in our institutions. So, our longstanding public serving institutions or governments can be trust in one another as well. I mentioned polarization a moment ago. And, the way in which humans seem to have less trust in institutions and each other. One of the trends that we're seeing, is that people are, tuning into social media, to influencers, as a way of kind of gathering their source of truth and their information instead of necessarily turning to things like evidence, right? Or to public institutions that have been trusted in order to provide, that information and that source of truth, so to speak. So, this is something, I'm very curious to see and track myself as, we think about how to support, places of work. I'm curious what this will look like in terms of trust in employment, and trust that we are being treated fairly, for example, or that our well-being is cared for. So, I think workplaces are really wise to, be aware of an environment of low trust. I think that it's, again, not just a one workplace thing, but a global concern that we're seeing, and think about some of the actions, the behaviors that help to restore trust or rebuild trust in a world where, trust is a currency that improves relationships, improves connections to the workplace, but can be hard to come by these days. So those are just some thoughts I wanted to share. Would love to hear, again, in the comments section, anything that's on your mind or other things, other trends that you see emerging that are impacting you either as a worker or as a workplace. Thank you for tuning in today. And, if there's something in this episode that you found value in that you would like to share with others, I always really appreciate the likes and the shares. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of these episodes. Thanks for listening today. Take good care of yourself and each other. Thanks for listening today. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not medical advice or mental health treatment. If you're struggling at work, please reach out to the supports within your workplace or community. This podcast was gratefully recorded on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations.